Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, debt slaves, peasants, vassals, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go to Eurasia. And this group of countries, these ex-Soviet republics that include Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. All these countries have all of a sudden popped up in these little stories in the news recently. And I started snooping around and found out that the IMF is working with a lot of these countries right now, and came to the fore because just this last January, Azerbaijan went into talks for some emergency loans and working with the IMF and World Bank. And then, like I say, I kind of noticed this trend, an interesting trend, and the timing is good. So it looks like U.S. policy, these sanctions on Russia, is help loosening these former Soviet republics and their dependence on Russia. We saw, a dramatic example of that, of course, in Ukraine, but we're seeing this IMF and World Bank and the international financial elites getting their hooks more in these countries recently. And there's a history of course, the IMF and the World Bank worked closely with a lot of the ex-Soviet republics when the Soviet Union collapsed. And in the middle of the late 90s, a lot of these countries were already working with the World Bank and the IMF and reconstructing their countries and trying to wean off the Soviet system. But what we find now, like I say, is a string of examples of this oil crunch and what it's doing to some of these Eurasian regions. And all these regions are important because, of course, there's a lot of Muslim populations, so there's a potential for some sort of volatility there, but also all these regions are rich in oil and gas, and for that reason, of course, they're going to be players in the geopolitical scene and of great interest to Western corporations and banks and big players. So the most recent example, like I say, is this last January, Azerbaijan. They're in discussions focused on programs to liberalize the economy and improve the business climate. And once I started digging through these articles and the IMF being involved in all these countries, I was amazed, or I shouldn't say amazed, that's a little strong. Surprised? No. Shocked? No. I guess I saw exactly what I thought I would see, is this common phrase to liberalize the economy and improve the business climate over and over again, because that's code for opening up to Western financiers and preparing themselves for banker occupation. And so Azerbaijan is in talks for a $4 billion emergency loan, although when you read it, they act like, oh, well, we don't need it. And we'll kind of let you know if we need it and when we need it. But yeah, $4 billion, that sounds pretty good. So the IMF, of course, is getting what it wants, where it goes in all these countries and forces these reforms in order to qualify for this IMF money. So Azerbaijan is trying to hold their dignity while they beg for this money. And but the president called for a comprehensive program of state asset sales and borrowing abroad. So they've been borrowing heavily from China now, and they want to borrow in the international market, which of course is music to their ears, and state asset sales, which is also music to their ears. So we're seeing the same kind of things. The IMF and World Bank, what they do, they're to people in the Eurozone like Greece, but also to these ex-Soviet republics. It's all the same game plan of resource control and wealth extraction. And in Azerbaijan, they also have banks closing, consolidating. The banking sector is so weak. They have so many bad loans. So, of course, the IMF is going to go in there and help them with all their bad loans. Of course, the IMF can't help anybody in the Eurozone with all their huge amount of bad loans, or the U.S. and their bad loans, or China and their bad loans. But IMF will help Azerbaijan with their bad loans. And then we have a story just February 23rd in 2016, just this year. Tajikistan is in talks over an IMF bailout too, and pretty much a repeat of what we see happening in Azerbaijan. And then we have Uzbekistan. Back in May of 2015, the IMF predicted 7.5% growth in the beginning of the year, but of course with the oil prices continuing to plummet, and it's affecting their economy somewhat, although they rely mostly on gas, but they've been pulling back on their Russian gas exporting and are actually moving more gas towards China. So that's obviously a case where the IMF and the World Bank and the U.S. are using this situation in order to move Uzbekistan to more of a China access, which is more comfortable for the future, whereas we are in confrontation with Russia. So this pullback from Russia will further help put the screws on Russia. And in fact, there's a pipeline from Turkmenistan that goes through Uzbekistan to China and delivers gas, and the Chinese have been very generous. And similar developments in the rest of the region that I've noticed as well. China going in and making these sweet deals and investing in infrastructure and helping, kind of the way they do in Africa as well. They're not in there militarily; they're just in there to help rebuild the country and help maybe make some investments pay off, and not to mention international goodwill. So then we have Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Azerbaijan, and then we also have Turkmenistan. November 2015, the IMF predicted a big dip in their economic growth, and sort of similar with Uzbekistan, they predicted a 7.5% growth, although there's been some pullbacks there. So the IMF hasn't been reliable in their predictions, and they probably aren't in most situations. And Turkmenistan, the same thing. They predicted a big dip, and well, in that case, there is a big dip because of falling oil and gas revenues next 2 years. But I guess why I hesitate to call it a big dip, because their growth in 2014 was 10%, 2015 was 7%, and they think it's only going to drop to 6% in 2016. So as far as growth rates go, that'd be the envy of a lot of countries in the world to have those kind of growth numbers. But of course, since they're state-owned and there's no diversity, and their entire economy essentially is based on energy, oil and gas reserves, there's a lot of corruption. And like I've always talked about, this collision of conspiracy and this business corruption, they just go hand in hand. So it's hard to say where the government ends and corrupt business practices end. And Turkmenistan is a good example of that, where, like I say, the numbers are cooked, everything's state-owned, and it's all about energy and oil. So it's ripe for the kind of corruption we see in all the countries that have this sort of economy. And once again, the IMF is applauding their austerity. So they're not going in there with a loan at this point, but they are applauding the austerity measures that Turkmenistan's already taken, and they're opening up their private sector and strengthening the banking sector. And whoa, I just said that a few minutes ago about one of the other IMF programs in one of these other regions. It's all about strengthening the banking sector and opening up to the private sector. And we know what that's code for, is opening up for Western rape, resource control, and strengthening the banking sector actually means making it the banking sector strong in the country, but weak and open to Western banking interests and financial interests. So there we see a little more consistency. Now we go to Kyrgyzstan. In May of 2015, they got a small IMF loan, $92 million, but once again, austerity and the usual opening up the private sector and strengthening the banking sector. And they just paid off a previous IMF loan from back in July of 2014. And so this new one is relatively more of a stopgap for now, but they'll probably be back to the trough like a lot of these countries if the price of oil and gas remains low. But one of the things about Kyrgyzstan is they have high debt, unlike a lot of these countries, and because of all these reforms imposed by the IMF in the previous arrangement. And they're kind of in a tough spot because they need this money from the IMF, but they're also tied to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. So they're lining up to join that, and they'll probably get a lot more help from Russia and the other countries in the Eurasian Economic Union. And that's probably explains the reason why they got such a small loan for the IMF. So the banking system in the country doesn't quite have the hooks in it that the IMF seems to be getting in some of these other countries. Although it is interesting that their banking system is so suspicious of the local currency that they mostly use the dollar and have a weak banking system. So a lot of things could change there pretty quick. But And once again, we have one of these countries, like all these countries here, like Kyrgyzstan. You wonder where the Chinese investment bank is, and are they going to start stepping in and filling the void for some of these countries? Because, like I say, there's a lot of Chinese investment in a lot of these countries, and you would think with the Chinese Asian infrastructure investment banks open for business now that they could be moving into some of these areas. But like Turkmenistan, even though they're not applying for a loan right now, they have that same profile that a lot of these countries do, where the IMF is coming in and asking them to drop government freebies, and so that's part of the destabilization in all these countries when the IMF and the World Bank and U.S. financiers and government bureaucrats come in and tell them they need to start cutting back on the subsidies and the freebies. And of course, when you go from the ex-Soviet system where everybody's taken care of to these subsidized systems where everybody's taken care of, there's a much larger chance of unrest in all these countries due to these austerity. We've seen when it's done on relatively calm countries in Europe and in the Eurozone. You can imagine what it can do in countries like these. So that's a very important part of this, and why it's interesting to watch IMF activities and austerity and in these ex-Soviet republics, because destabilization and fragmentation as a geopolitical tool is still going on and being used in these areas. And but we have Kazakhstan as one example of a country that's kind of getting through this a little better. They had an IMF visit in November 17th of 2015, and they discussed bank reforms and opening up to the private sector. There's that mantra again, and they welcome new privatization. So that's what the IMF is applauding Kazakhstan. Now, Kazakhstan has no plans to turn to the IMF right now, although that could change in a couple of days or weeks or months. They tend to use so-called structural reforms, which will probably be more austerity. But they repaid their previous debt to the IMF back in 2000, the one they got in the mid-90s, and they haven't borrowed since, so they're about due. But they're a little more adamant than some of these other countries that I've talked about, and they may resist getting involved with Western financiers. But nonetheless, the IMF welcomed new privatization. So Kazakhstan, as part of their structural reforms, will be new privatizations and selling stuff off. So they'll be on a large scale too, and so this will be selling off probably to Western interests, and that'll keep the IMF at bay until the IMF needs to be brought in to make the financial rape of all these countries complete. But so there it is. Just an interesting pattern to watch. This trend is popping up with this oil crunch that all these Eurasian ex-Soviet republics right on the Russian border, I might add, with potentially volatile Muslim populations in a lot of these countries. Just another area to watch as fragmentation, destabilization continues, and then the IMF goes in there to finish them off, and there's a pattern of that here right now. So I know it's not on anybody's radar, but it's something that a useful idiot keeps his radar on. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. Don't you be one too.